For over 4 decades, the state of California was gripped by fear. A faceless predator moved through its neighborhoods, slipping silently into the homes of unsuspecting families. He was the figure that lurked in the darkness, the monster who became known by many names. At first, he was the Visalia Ransacker, then the Area Rapist, and later the original Night Stalker. For years, his identity remained a mystery, until one spring evening in 2018, when it was finally revealed that the Golden State Killer was not some shadowy figure hiding in the bushes, but a man who had been living in plain sight. A husband, a father, a retired police officer. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. Welcome to the true stories of the Diary of Darkness. Let's delve into the case of the Golden State Killer. Our story begins on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, where Joseph James DeAngelo, JRB, was born. He was the eldest of 4 children in a military family, with his father serving in the U.S. Army. The DeAngelo household was anything but stable. The family moved frequently due to his father's deployments, never staying in one place for long. This constant upheaval made it difficult for young Joseph to form connections or friendships. His father was a stern, authoritarian figure, and it was said that he often ruled the house with an iron fist. The tension within the family, coupled with the instability of their constant moves, left Joseph feeling isolated. By the time the family settled in California, Joseph was a teenager. It was around this time that those who knew him noticed signs of a troubled young man. He was intelligent, but had a quick temper. He was meticulous, but also prone to outbursts of anger. His childhood friends would later recall incidents of cruelty towards animals, a dark foreshadowing of what was to come. Still, no one could have predicted the depths of the darkness that would eventually consume him. In the late 1960s, DeAngelo enlisted in the Navy and served during the Vietnam War. This period of his life seemed to provide him with a sense of structure, something that had been missing during his tumultuous childhood. But after his service ended, he struggled to adapt to civilian life. He enrolled at California State University, Sacramento, where he studied criminal justice, a field that would later prove ironic, considering the career he would embark on. He graduated in 1972 and soon joined law enforcement, becoming a police officer. For a time, it seemed like Joseph DeAngelo had found his place in the world. He was married, had children, and was working a respectable job. But beneath the surface, something far darker was brewing. By night, he was not the upstanding officer of the law he pretended to be. Instead, he was prowling the quiet neighborhoods of California, his mind fixated on a twisted compulsion he could no longer control. It all began in Visalia, a small quiet town where DeAngelo had been assigned as a police officer. Between 1974 and 1975, a string of burglaries began to plague the area. The intruder was dubbed the Visalia Ransacker. At first, he seemed content with simply breaking into homes and rifling through personal belongings. But as the months went on, his actions became bolder and more disturbing. He would break in, ransack drawers, and take bizarre items, like wedding rings and photographs of ex that had little monetary value, but carried deep personal significance to the victims. The ransacker didn't just steal. He played psychological games. He would move objects around the house, leaving behind signs that he had been there, but always slipping away before anyone could catch him. The residents of Visalia were terrified. They would wake up in the middle of the night to strange sounds, only to find their homes turned upside down. Then, in September of 1975, the terror escalated. A young detective named Claude Snelling was shot and killed while trying to stop the ransacker from kidnapping his teenage daughter. It was the first time the prowler had taken a life, but it would not be the last. Despite the increasing violence, the Visalia Ransacker managed to evade capture. But by 1976, the burglaries abruptly stopped. It was as if the mysterious intruder had vanished into thin air. Unbeknownst to the residents of Visalia, he had simply moved on, taking his twisted activities to the suburbs of Sacramento, where he would soon earn a new name, the Area Rapist. The year was 1976, and Sacramento was a city on edge. A series of brutal rapes began occurring in the quiet neighborhoods where families felt safe. The attacks were methodical and terrifying. The assailant would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines, understanding the layout of their homes. He would often break in beforehand, leaving doors and windows unlocked to make his entrance easier on the night of the attack. When he finally struck, it was with the precision of a predator who had rehearsed his moves countless times. He wore a ski mask and gloves, leaving no fingerprints behind. He would shine a flashlight into his victims' eyes, blinding them as he bound their hands and feet with shoelaces he had brought with him. The East Area Rapist was ruthless, but he was also cruelly methodical. He didn't just assault his victims physically. He tormented them psychologically. He would whisper threats, taunt them with promises that he would return. And sometimes, he would remain in the house long after the assault was over, eating food from their kitchens or simply sitting in the dark, listening to the sounds of his victims' sobs. The attacks continued for 3 years, with more than 50 women assaulted in their own homes. The East Area Rapist became bolder, often attacking couples in their beds. He would bind the husband, stacking plates on his back, and warning him that if he heard the plates rattle, he would kill his wife. Then, he would drag the woman into another room, subjecting her to hours of terror, while her helpless partner could do nothing but listen. But just as suddenly as the attacks began, they stopped. In 1979, the East Area Rapist vanished, leaving behind a city that was forever changed. People were relieved, but there was a lingering sense of dread. Where had he gone? What had become of the man who had terrorized their community for so long? As the years turned into decades, the case of the Golden State Killer became one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The crime spanned more than a decade, with the perpetrator seeming to vanish without a trace by the mid-1980s. Despite numerous theories and investigative leads, detectives were left chasing shadows. The trail had long gone cold, and it seemed as though the Golden State Killer might escape justice forever. But what the killer didn't anticipate was how technology would evolve especially DNA forensics, and a technique that no one could have predicted would eventually be his downfall. Advances in DNA testing allowed detectives to confirm that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were, in fact, the same person. This discovery linked dozens of rapes and at least 13 murders across California. Despite this breakthrough, they still had no name to match the DNA profile. Then, in 2018, new investigative technique changed everything: genetic genealogy. This method, which had been used mostly for identifying unknown remains or connecting distant relatives, involved cross-referencing crime scene DNA with genetic profiles submitted by the public to online genealogy databases. Detectives realized that they could upload the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to one of these public databases to see if there were any distant relatives that matched. The hope was that, through a process of elimination and building a family tree, they could zero in on their suspect. Eventually, they narrowed their list down to a handful of men who fit the profile, both geographically and in terms of age. The most promising name that came up was Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living in the Sacramento area. To confirm their theory, detectives needed to obtain a fresh DNA sample from DeAngelo, but they had to do it covertly. If he caught wind of the investigation, he could disappear, taking any chance of solving the case with him. Investigators set up surveillance outside DeAngelo's modest home in Citrus Heights. They followed him for days, waiting for an opportunity. Finally, they struck gold. On one occasion, DeAngelo discarded some trash while working in his front yard. Detectives retrieved the item used tissue and sent it to the lab for testing. The results were conclusive. The DNA from the tissue matched the DNA from multiple Golden State Killer crime scenes. On April 24, 2018, over 40 years after his reign of terror began, police officers quietly surrounded DeAngelo's suburban home. They wanted to avoid a standoff. No one knew how this violent, unpredictable man would react when confronted. As DeAngelo worked on his motorcycle in the driveway, they moved in. For a moment, he seemed confused. Then, without much resistance, he was taken into custody. The Golden State Killer, the man who had eluded capture for decades, was finally behind bars. But there was still one more battle to fight: the courtroom. Joseph DeAngelo, now in his early 70s, was a frail, hunched figure who appeared to be a shadow of the powerful, ruthless predator he had once been. Yet, even in custody, he maintained his cold, detached demeanor. During interrogations, he muttered vague confessions, claiming an inner voice named Jerry had driven him to commit the crimes. It was a bizarre and desperate attempt to absolve himself, but no one was buying it. The legal proceedings that followed were extensive. DeAngelo was charged with 13 counts of murder and numerous counts of kidnapping. Unfortunately, due to the statute of limitations, he could not be charged for the rapes he committed in the 1970s. However, the sheer volume of murder charges was enough to ensure he would never walk free again. In June 2020, DeAngelo struck a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea agreement required him to admit to dozens of additional crimes for which he had not been formally charged. Let me know what you think of this case and any more you would like to see. Till next time.